Top of the show, instead of standing up for Israel, calling out the barbarism of Hamas, Australia voted with all the other weak nations at the United Nations calling for an immediate ceasefire. In other words, handing Hamas a victory. Here's our ambassador to the UN speaking this morning.
The world has witnessed a harrowing number of civilian deaths, including children. This must not continue.
Let's bring in Colin Rubenstein, Executive Director of the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Good to talk to you again, Colin. You must be very, very disappointed with this action by Australia. It breaks with the normal support Australia gives Israel at the United Nations, and really it leads to a break in bipartisan support in this country, strong support for Israel.
Yes, it's profoundly disappointing, Chris. It's deeply confusing and contradictory with the professed aims of Australia, even spelt out in that rather, in part problematic, but in other parts positive statement with New Zealand and Canada last night. That Hamas should be disarmed. It should stop using Gaza civilians as human shields and so on.
I'll come to that statement in a moment, but with the UN resolution, there was an amendment put up that would have condemned the October the 7th atrocity that started this war, and that amendment was defeated. Surely that was the clearest signal ever to Australia. How can you vote for this resolution if that amendment can't be included?
100%. I mean, Australia is committed to Hamas being disarmed and its power, military and political, dismantled. And here we are calling for the release of the hostages and a meaningful ceasefire, which means Hamas has to surrender or it has to be militarily defeated. Otherwise, it's a fool's errand. And all we're doing in voting for this resolution is compounding the problem, ensuring continuing violence from Hamas. It's a victory for Hamas. It survives to fight another day as it will, to pursue its barbaric goals of not only destroying Israel, but killing Jews, as we know. And of course, it puts paid to any prospect of moving towards some sort of resolution towards a two-state outcome. It also enables them to continue with their war crimes, their double war crimes, not only killing innocent Israelis and rocket fired on Israelis to this very day, trying to kill as many civilians as possible, but deliberately putting their own civilians at risk as human shields. And unfortunately, it's obvious the more civilians are killed, the more it helps their propaganda campaign. And I don't care about it, nor do their backers, the Iranians. And not enough talk and hostility and criticism is directed to the big daddy of all of this, Iran, and proxies of Hamas is one.
I think there's no doubt about your interpretation of how this UN vote and Australia's support with it that will only be deleterious when it comes to the foreign policy approach here. And the pressure should be internationally on Hamas rather than Israel. I just want to show you a news update because we're not seeing enough of this. We're only getting a one-sided version of what's happening in Gaza. The Jerusalem Post today reporting about this woman, one of the hostages taken on October the 7th. Her name is Eden Zechariah, a 28-year-old who was kidnapped from that Nova festival. She is dead. Her body was found in one of the Hamas tunnels in Gaza. Her boyfriend, Ofek Kimchi, was also killed trying to shield her, and 2 Israeli soldiers have been killed trying to retrieve her body. That's what's going on now in Gaza. That's the Israeli side of it that you don't hear about, and it is just absolutely tragic and brutally atrocious. Getting back to this resolution and what it does here in Australia, with Australia voting for that resolution. What concerns me, Colin, is obviously it makes you and your community, the Jewish Australian communities in Melbourne and Sydney in particular, feel more vulnerable. But won't this embolden the extreme protesters we've seen who have been chanting death to the Jews and have been intimidating Jewish communities? They're going to feel emboldened by this because the government's kind of giving some legitimacy to their protests.
Unfortunately, it only fuels the resurgent anti-Semitism we've already seen, Chris, and that's a very worrying prospect. It's a worrying prospect, not only for our community, but for the viability of the future of Australian multicultural democracy. I mean, our multicultural democracy depends on commitment to certain core values.
Sure
and
does.
when those values are violated and the authorities not only don't condemn them, but law enforcement does not act, you see an unravelling of our civilised society.
We're nearly out of...
There's a serious concern for all of us.
It certainly is, Colin. We're nearly out of time, but I do just want to get back to get a final comment from you on that joint statement between Australia, New Zealand and Canada. And the quote that you alluded to, I've got it here. It says, we want to see this pause resumed and support urgent international efforts towards a sustainable ceasefire. This cannot be one-sided. Hamas must release all hostages, stop using Palestinian civilians as human shields. Now, that sentiment is right, but that should be at the very top of the agenda. That should be the starting point. This is like 6 paragraphs into that statement. What would your message be on behalf of the Australian Jewish community to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese right now on this issue?
To revisit this issue, the only way forward for safety and security, not only for Israel, but for Gazan civilians who have been cruelly abused by this tyrannical, barbaric Hamas leadership, is to stick with Israel to make sure that Hamas is unravelled, so that those conditions that you rightly pointed out to yesterday actually met. So we have a future of moving forward, not only for safety and security and peace for Israel, but also a prospect for a new Palestinian leadership to emerge to pursue the interests of the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank as well, for that matter.
Well said, Colin. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Colin Rubenstein there from AJAC. Now, still